Hey guys, tonight we step back thousands of years to the banks of the Nile, where the air smells faintly of yeast, baked clay, and river mud, and where the day begins, not with alarm clocks, but with the soft, golden glow of dawn creeping across mud brick walls. You trudge through narrow streets, ducking under low wooden awnings, toes crunching on scattered straw, and immediately notice the clamour of a bakery coming to life. Clay ovens sigh, metal tools clang, and flour dust drifts lazily in shafts of sunlight, catching in your eyelashes like tiny stars. It's warm, slightly sticky and faintly sweet, smelling of yesterday's bread and a hint of beer. Because yes, ancient Egyptians occasionally used beer in dough, making each loaf a mild, yeasty celebration of the day to come. You probably won't survive this if you imagine trying to keep up, because the pace is both deliberate and relentless, a dance between heat, dough, and shadow. Still, you are here, curious, inhaling the steam rising from bubbling pots of water used to soften grains, and clay jars holding yeast that might be more mystical than scientific. Your eyes trace the rough edges of wooden paddles, scarred by centuries of kneading, while a faint wind carries a faint whisper of debate. Historians still argue whether these bakers' routines were standardized across the city or varied wildly block by block. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love imagining this bakery across the globe, from Toronto to Tokyo. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first light stretches across the bakery courtyard, glinting off a series of low, rectangular clay ovens, each puffing tiny clouds of smoke. You notice the apprentices scurrying about, carrying small reed trays lined with dough. Their movements are careful, yet slightly chaotic, each step measured, each loaf positioned precisely, as though the bread itself were a delicate, living entity. You bend closer to inspect a shadow clock leaning against the wall, a flat stone disc with a gnomon in the center, simple yet elegant. Its engraved lines mark the passing hours, yet the soft sunlight bends unpredictably, reminding you that time here is not measured in minutes, but in subtle shifts of light. Some scholars suggest that bakers adjusted their work to the sun's arc rather than strict hours, while others argue the shadow clocks indicate a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of time. A faint giggle escapes from a young apprentice, flour puffing from his sleeves as he tries to mimic the master's kneading technique. You watch the rhythmic motion, palms pressing, folding, pressing again, dough sticking to fingers and boards. Historians still argue whether the singing that sometimes accompanies this ritual, soft melodic chants muttered to the loaves, was a genuine part of training or simply a fringe superstition to keep boredom at bay. You probably won't survive a whole week of kneading at dawn, yet here for tonight, you simply observe, inhale the comforting aroma, and imagine the day stretching out in warm, measured increments. You pause to notice small details, a tiny smear of honey on a workbench, stray grains of wheat rolling across the floor, and the sound of water dripping from a clay jar into a shallow bowl. These details are mundane yet hypnotic, a perfect lullaby of daily life. The master baker lifts a loaf with a practiced flick of the wrist, transferring it to a reed tray, and the apprentice mirrors, slightly offbeat, eliciting a soft, affectionate chuckle from the master. You're reminded that life in the baker's quarter is precise, yet filled with small human quirks, little jokes, tiny mistakes, and subtle patterns that repeat like a gentle river current. By the time the first sunbeam strikes the courtyard floor, you feel as if you've been here for hours, though it has been moments of slow immersion, measured by scent, light, and the muted clatter of daily tools. You catch a whiff of bread just starting to brown in the oven, the smell curling in lazy spirals, teasing your senses. You remember, perhaps, that crocodile dung sunscreen you read about earlier. Yes, history is full of odd practical solutions, but here, the simple combination of flour, water, and yeast is both necessary and magical, bridging centuries in a single inhalation. And so, you stand quietly, letting the bakery hum around you, sensing the gentle rhythm of work, time, and sun shadow, and imagining the day unfolding with measured, flour-dusted patience. Each movement, each puff of smoke, each shift in light is a small heartbeat of ancient life, a lullaby in the making, coaxing you gently toward a slower, calmer awareness of the past and its quiet wonders. The tools here are deceptively simple, yet each carries the weight of centuries and the whispers of countless bakers who came before. You wander closer to the shadow clocks propped against the walls, their sun-bleached stone surfaces etched with precise lines, some worn nearly smooth by repeated measurements. The gnomons jut up like tiny watchtowers, casting slender dancing shadows that slide lazily across the face of the dial. You lift your hand, following the thin shadow with your finger, and realize how much patience it requires to translate this silent shift of light into a tangible sense of time. Every line, every mark, every tiny notch matters, and yet there's a playful imperfection, as though each baker left a subtle fingerprint on the measurement itself. Scholars still argue whether these tools were universally standardized, or if each workshop developed its own idiosyncratic system, with apprentices secretly measuring their master's whims as much as the sun. Nearby, you notice measuring rods, simple sticks or flat wooden planks with incisions that indicate lengths for kneading or loaf size. Some are painted with faint red or black pigment, marking ideal quantities, or serving as reminders of customary proportions. You reach out to trace one of the grooves with your fingertip, feeling the grain of the wood and the slight bump where a master baker may have carved in haste. There's a fringe theory that some of these rods doubled as miniature abacuses, allowing bakers to calculate ratios of flour to water with surprising sophistication. You chuckle softly to yourself, imagining a baker tapping out equations with his stick while the dough rested. A row of small scales catches your attention, delicate balance beams perched precariously on wooden supports. Copper pans hang on either side, ready to weigh grains, honey, or tiny jars of yeast. You lift one pan experimentally, marveling at the precision required to ensure every loaf is consistent. It's easy to forget that this consistency is partly what gave bread its societal importance. Loaves were not just food, but symbols of order, stability, and even religious propriety. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptian bakers approached their work more as ritual or practical necessity, or if perhaps it was a seamless blend of both. Peering into a storage area, you notice odd little containers, some no bigger than a fist, with lids shaped like tiny pyramids or the heads of animals. The clay is rough, mottled, and smudged with fingerprints. You realize these were used to store yeast starters, and some of the containers have strange markings, possibly reminders, possibly decorative motifs meant to invoke luck. There's a fringe notion that certain jars were charged with chants or blessings, ensuring that the bread would rise properly. While it sounds whimsical, you can almost picture the baker whispering into the clay in the early morning. Hush, your gaze drifts to a curious semicircular device leaning in the corner. A protractor-like instrument made of polished wood with a string attached at the pivot. You bend closer and learn it's likely a tool for measuring angles of sunlight and predicting optimal kneading or baking times. Imagine a baker adjusting his shadow clock, glancing at the protractor, then lifting a paddleful of dough with satisfaction. Scholars still argue whether this was standard practice or an experimental innovation used by only a handful of particularly meticulous bakers. As you explore, the sounds of the courtyard shift, clay ovens huffing, water sloshing in shallow basins, the soft scrape of reed trays against worn stone. The tools you handle and observe are more than instruments. They are extensions of the baker's knowledge, each telling a story of careful observation, centuries of trial, and subtle improvisation. You notice a faint scorch mark on a scale pan, a shadow line slightly deeper than the others, perhaps indicating a loaf that burned, a measurement off by a hair. These small imperfections humanize the system, a reminder that even in a society famed for precision, minor quirks mattered. You pause by a flat stone slab used for kneading, tracing the grooves left from previous days. Imagine generations of hands pressing dough here, each motion leaving an imprint on the surface. There's a fringe idea that bakers could read the slab, judging the rhythm and technique of past workers, almost like a tactile diary. You smile, imagining apprentices trying to decipher these subtle messages while balancing sticky dough, sun-shifted shadows, and the occasional curious cat slinking between trays. Finally, you step back and take in the courtyard as a whole, noticing how every tool, rod, pan, and slab seems to have its exact place, forming a choreography of motion and light. The shadow clocks bend and flex with the sun, measuring an invisible rhythm. Scales and rods anchor precision, yet small quirks, smudges, cracks, uneven lines, remind you that perfection was never fully achieved, only approximated. And so, standing amidst these humble yet intricate tools, you feel the gentle hum of time itself, waiting for the next loaf to rise and the next shadow to fall. You bend over the wide, low tables where morning kneading begins, and immediately the tactile magic of dough takes hold. Your fingers sink into the soft, pliable mass, sticky against your palms as if the wheat itself is conspiring to slow you down. Flour dust swirls in lazy spirals, catching the sunlight and settling on your arms and hair like a faint, dusty halo. You tap your heel against the stone floor to shake off the sleepy haze, listening to the soft, rhythmic thump of wooden paddles hitting dough, a sound that is somehow both grounding and hypnotic. You begin to understand that kneading is less about brute strength and more about patience, timing, and subtle pressure. A tactile conversation between you, your hands, and the ever-changing texture of wheat, water, and yeast as you press, fold, and stretch. You notice the apprentices around you are not just learning to shape bread, they are learning to interpret the dough itself. Some claim that when it resists, the loaf is shy, a quirky notion that might elicit a smirk today, but which guided bakers' intuition. You probably won't survive a full week of this sensory immersion, but right now, the rhythm feels meditative, almost like a whispered conversation with the past. You glance sideways at a slightly older baker humming a soft, lilting tune, apparently to keep the loaves happy. Scholars still argue whether these melodic rituals genuinely affected fermentation, or were simply comforting background noise for long, repetitive mornings. Water is poured with deliberate care into shallow stone basins, droplets glinting like tiny jewels as they scatter across the surface. Yeast, carefully scooped from clay jars, is folded into the mixture, tiny bubbles forming almost magically as the water and grains meet. You lean close to inhale a faint tang of sourness and warmth. It's as if the smell itself is designed to lull you into focus. Some bakers sprinkle in a pinch of salt or a drizzle of honey, and you notice a fringe idea that certain secret herbs or crushed seeds might have been included, not for flavor, but as subtle protective charms for successful rising. You shake your head with a smile, imagining future historians poring over these recipes and debating whether they were culinary necessity or mystical superstition. As your hands continue their gentle, circular motion, you begin to notice patterns emerging. The dough stretches, collapses, then blooms again under measured pressure, almost like watching a tiny universe expand and contract beneath your fingertips. Apprentices whisper softly to each other, mimicking their master's careful cadence. You probably won't survive the exactitude required to make each loaf uniform, yet the process feels oddly forgiving. Small mistakes result in slightly misshapen but still perfectly edible bread. There's a comforting rhythm to imperfection, a gentle reminder that history was lived, not perfected. Your attention drifts to the surface of the kneading table, noticing faint scratches and indentations from generations of bakers. These marks, almost imperceptible, are a tactile archive of practice, failed experiments, and the occasional playful scribble. You think about a quirky theory that bakers read these surfaces to learn which techniques produced optimal rise, a kind of hands-on apprenticeship diary encoded in stone. Scholars still debate whether such interpretations are credible or simply romanticized conjecture. A breeze rustles through the courtyard, carrying the faint aroma of freshly harvested grain mixed with the smoke of nearby ovens. You pause to notice small, almost imperceptible details. A stray feather caught in the flour, a clumsy apprentice dusting off his arms, or the faint shimmer of morning sunlight reflecting off a puddle in the uneven floor. Each of these tiny occurrences folds into the sensory mosaic of kneading, making it feel alive rather than mechanical. And then there's the occasional chuckle when someone discovers a piece of dough sticking to their sleeve. A humorous reminder that even in disciplined practice, human error is inevitable. As the morning progresses, your movements become more fluid, your attention attuned to the subtle shifts in dough elasticity, temperature, and scent. You remember the master baker's chant, barely audible but persistent, and start to wonder whether your loaves would rise better if you hummed along. There's a fringe belief that sound vibrations actually aid fermentation, and while most historians treat this idea with skepticism, you can't help imagining the loaves listening and responding with tiny bubbles and folds. By the time you push back from the table, flour dusting your arms and a faint sheen of sweat on your brow, you feel a gentle sense of accomplishment. Kneading is not just physical labor, it is a slow, deliberate meditation, a dance with ingredients, time, and shadow. You notice the courtyard now bathed in brighter light, the shadow clock casting longer, more precise lines. And you realize that every loaf shaped in this morning hour carries a story of patience, rhythm, and quiet human ingenuity. You probably won't survive a month of this without aching hands. But for tonight, the gentle, flory cadence of kneading has lulled your mind into a meditative calm, ready to drift into the next phase of the day. Water moves like liquid gold from clay jars into shallow basins, and you follow its quiet path, tracing each droplet as if it were a thread connecting past and present. You lift a small scoop of yeast from its resting jar, feeling the granular texture between your fingers, noting the faint, almost sweet aroma that hints at both fermentation and the warmth of yesterday's loaves. You carefully fold it into the mixture of flour and water, watching tiny bubbles appear like the first stars of evening, each one a promise of life and rise. You probably won't survive a week of observing every precise pour and pinch. But in this moment, the rhythm feels hypnotic, a gentle lullaby of daily routine measured in droplets and grams rather than hours. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptian bakers had a scientific understanding of fermentation, or whether they relied entirely on trial, error, and intuition passed down through generations. Nearby, a young apprentice gestures at a jar with a carved lid shaped like a small falcon. "This one is special," the master says with a quiet grin. Some bakers believe that certain jars contain yeast blessed by whispered chants, or that the shape of the container influences the rise. A quirky ritual that may sound whimsical to us but was treated with utmost seriousness at the time. You run your fingers over the carved surface, feeling tiny grooves worn smooth by repeated handling, and imagine the conversations and secrets embedded in the clay over centuries. Fringe theories suggest that bakers would even talk to the yeast, murmuring encouragements or softly reciting the day's prayers. An intimate partnership between human and microbe. You watch as water is measured with surprising precision. Long ago, bakers realized that too much or too little could alter the dough dramatically, and they developed a variety of bowls and measuring implements to ensure consistency. Some of these tools are elegantly simple: a hollowed gourd, a carved wooden ladle, or even a length of cord marked at intervals. You note how the interplay of gravity, angle, and volume was understood instinctively, almost like a gentle physics lesson embedded in daily work. Historians still debate whether these methods were universal across Egyptian bakeries or developed independently by local workshops experimenting with different grains and water sources. As you pour and fold, the sun climbs higher, casting sharper lines across the courtyard and illuminating small grains of flour that float lazily in the warm morning air. You inhale, savoring the scent of yeast mingled with water and grain, a comforting perfume that seems designed to keep bakers alert yet relaxed. Some claim that water was often sourced from specific sections of the Nile, or even collected at certain times of day, thought to optimize the chemical properties for rising dough. While the evidence is scarce, it adds a layer of ritual and mystique, showing how practical and symbolic concerns intertwined. You kneel beside a clay jar filled with slightly spongy starter, noticing its gentle froth. A soft, almost imperceptible sound comes from it as bubbles break and reform. A quiet symphony you wouldn't normally hear, yet here it resonates in the courtyard. Some bakers whispered to these jars, believing that careful attention could coax better growth, a small human touch amplifying the natural process. Fringe theories extend to the idea that particular chants, inflections, or even hand gestures might influence the yeast, though scholars remain skeptical, noting that success rates likely owed more to experience than incantation. You start to fold the starter into the main dough, feeling the mixture resist, then yield, then expand again under your palms. Every movement matters. Too rough, and you risk breaking air pockets. Too gentle, and the dough may not develop structure. Apprentices move cautiously, watching your hands, learning the nuances of touch that aren't recorded anywhere else but in memory and muscle. You probably won't survive a month of this tactile training, yet observing it feels meditative, like watching a quiet conversation between generations, clay jars, water, and flour. Some bakers even incorporated tiny amounts of beer or fermented grain liquid, giving dough a subtle, sweet tang. You notice the faint aroma rising from a bowl on the far side of the courtyard, reminding you that flavor was sometimes secondary to texture and rise. Historians still argue whether these additions were deliberate flavor experiments or pragmatic ways to improve fermentation consistency. You reach for a small pinch of honey to mix in, smiling at the thought that even in the 3rd millennium BCE, someone had the same instinct to sweeten life slightly. By mid-morning, the courtyard is alive with quiet energy. Apprentices bending over bowls, dough forming bubbles and folds, water shimmering in basins, and the shadow clock slowly sliding across the wall. You pause for a moment, letting the gentle hum of activity sink in. Every pour, every pinch, every stir is a measured step in an ancient dance. Ritual, science, and quiet artistry intertwined. The day is still young, yet you feel immersed, almost weightless, carried along by the soft rhythm of water, yeast, and human hands, anticipating the warmth of ovens and the satisfying scent of soon-to-be-baked loaves. The midday heat presses against your skin as you step closer to the ovens, and you can feel the radiating warmth even from a few feet away. Clay walls glow orange from the embers inside, and the air is rich with the smell of baked grain, smoke, and faintly sweet honey. You probably won't survive a whole day in this heat without retreating for a cool sip of water. Yet for now, you simply inhale deeply, letting the tactile warmth of the courtyard meld with the sensory rhythm you've been following since dawn. The ovens are not just tools, they are living instruments, their heat carefully regulated by layers of reeds, clay, and occasional adjustments of the fire within. Historians still argue whether ancient bakers achieved remarkably precise temperatures, or if they relied on experience and intuition alone. You peer inside one oven, feeling the dry, enveloping heat lick your forearms as you slide a reed tray of dough carefully along the embers. The smell of the baking loaves curls around you in soft golden spirals. Some bakers hung thin mats of woven reeds over trays as a delicate shield, an odd precaution to prevent scorching, while still letting heat circulate evenly. A fringe idea suggests that these mats were even used to convey subtle spiritual protection to the bread, warding off bad fortune or poor fermentation, though evidence remains anecdotal. You imagine the apprentice who first had to learn this step, fumbling with trays, mats, and the peculiar stubbornness of the oven itself. You notice small charms tucked near the oven doors, tiny amulets of faience and stone, often depicting animals or protective symbols. Some bakers swore that positioning these talismans correctly ensured that loaves rose predictably. It seems whimsical, almost like adding sprinkles to a birthday cake, yet it reflects the subtle blending of ritual, superstition, and practice. Historians debate whether these charms were practical reminders, magical reinforcements, or merely comforting objects for bakers' peace of mind. You probably won't survive taking these at face value for a week straight, but watching them now, they add a gentle sense of personality to the otherwise precise mechanics of baking. A small breeze carries the scent of wheat and smoke, rustling through the courtyard and brushing against your cheeks. You lean close to a loaf rising near the oven opening, observing tiny bubbles forming beneath the dough's surface. A master baker taps the crust gently with a fingertip, listening to the hollow ring and nodding in quiet approval. Some scholars suggest that bakers could predict the perfect time to remove loaves purely by sound, a subtle skill honed over years of practice, while others argue that it was more art than science, relying heavily on instinct and environmental cues. You step back to watch the apprentices managing trays, and a minor mishap makes you grin. One tray tilts slightly, letting a loaf wobble, only to settle back safely as if it had a mind of its own. This kind of daily minor chaos seems perfectly normal, part of the charm and humor of working in these hot, smoky kitchens. Fringe theories hold that bakers sometimes baked miniature loaves as offerings to household gods, or to test dough behavior in different oven positions. Tiny experiments hidden within the ordinary flow of work. The clay ovens themselves are marvels of engineering, each built to maximize radiant heat while conserving fuel. Some are sunken into the earth to retain warmth, while others have tall chimneys to control airflow. You probably won't survive mastering every oven type, yet standing here, you can appreciate the subtle genius of their design. Shadows flicker across walls as embers glow brighter, the heat rising in waves, creating a kind of tactile music that accompanies the smell of bread. You notice a tray of dough set slightly apart from the rest. Its texture is unusual, perhaps due to a secret ingredient or a slightly different kneading technique. The master baker inspects it carefully, nudging it with a paddle and observing how it responds to heat. Scholars still argue whether such deviations were intentional experiments or happy accidents later celebrated for taste and texture. You smile, realizing that even in this highly structured environment, there is space for curiosity, improvisation, and small, Delightful surprises. By mid-afternoon, the courtyard hums with a gentle, steady rhythm. Trays slide smoothly, apprentices move in practiced sequences, and ovens release periodic puffs of aromatic smoke. You probably won't survive a long career here, but for now, you are a silent observer, immersed in the tactile, olfactory, and visual symphony of midday baking. Each movement, each adjustment, each rising bubble is part of an ongoing dialogue between human skill, natural processes, and the ever-present sun casting shadows on the wall. You feel a subtle calm settle over you, the warmth wrapping around like a soft blanket, preparing you for the next stage of the day, where precision and observation blend seamlessly with creativity and ritual. You return to the courtyard and find yourself drawn to the shadow clock, the simple stone disc that has been quietly marking the hours since morning. The gnomon casts a thin, elongated shadow that slides imperceptibly across the engraved lines, a gentle golden hand ticking without a sound. You probably won't survive a day of obsessively tracking this subtle movement, yet there is something mesmerizing about the way light interacts with these ancient tools. Every fraction of an inch the shadow moves represents a careful measurement, a whisper of time translated into work, pause, and motion. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians relied on exact hours or merely rough approximations that suited the natural rhythm of day and labor. You trace the shadow with a fingertip, watching it drift slowly along the curve. Around you, apprentices pause briefly, aligning trays and tools with reference to the shadow, as though the sun itself were supervising their diligence. Some scholars suggest that shadow clocks were primarily symbolic, a way to structure life rather than to measure time with precision, while others argue that the markings indicate surprisingly sophisticated observations, accurate to within a few minutes. You inhale, imagining the subtle triumph of mastering these measurements day after day, aware that every loaf, every knead, and every pour might be governed by this quiet ruler of light. Nearby, a small cluster of rods and sticks lie in neat rows. Some have faint incisions, others simple carvings to mark units of measure. You reach down to pick one up, feeling the worn edges and the faint polish where hands have passed over it countless times. Fringe theories suggest these rods doubled as mnemonic devices, guiding bakers in ratios and times without written instructions, a tactile cheat sheet passed from master to apprentice. You probably won't survive memorizing all these subtle cues, yet observing them now, it becomes clear that these tools are not just instruments. They are a bridge between knowledge and practice. The courtyard is quiet, except for the low murmur of movement and the occasional puff of smoke from an oven. You note how shadows extend across walls, how the sun's arc shifts imperceptibly, and how bakers instinctively adjust their actions to these changes. Some loaves are rotated, others slightly repositioned, demonstrating that timing is not rigid but responsive. Historians still debate whether bakers coordinated precisely with the shadow clock or whether their movements were guided more by habit and observation. You watch, fascinated, as subtle cues guide human hands, transforming sunlight into workflow. You crouch to observe a small apprentice attempting to match the tray alignment to the shadow line. He hesitates, then adjusts with a soft scrape, stepping back to admire his work. You notice a faint smile from the master baker, acknowledging both accuracy and effort. Fringe evidence suggests that some bakers would practice their shadow clock alignment on empty trays first, honing a skill that seemed mundane, but actually required acute attention and subtle understanding of light, angle, and space. You probably won't survive a week of this level of attentiveness. Yet the quiet dedication is hypnotic, almost like watching meditation in motion. Sunlight shifts again, elongating shadows across the courtyard. You follow the line cast by the gnomon, noting how it crosses over ovens, trays, and work tables, almost touching each element in turn. There's a gentle rhythm to it, a slow, predictable pulse that harmonizes with the movement of apprentices and masters alike. Historians still argue whether these markings dictated precise baking schedules, or if they were primarily symbolic cues for pacing the day. Regardless, you feel the subtle reassurance of a world ordered by light, a gentle, sun-driven timetable guiding hands, eyes, and minds. As the afternoon wears on, you find yourself relaxing into the gentle rhythm. The shadow clock's motion, a quiet metronome. You watch loaves rise and fall in subtle sync with the light, bubbles forming and collapsing, the aroma of bread blending seamlessly with the warmth of sun-warmed clay. You probably won't survive maintaining perfect attention to every increment of shadow, yet the experience is calming, hypnotic, a quiet meditation on the subtle interplay between human skill and natural patterns. The day stretches lazily, measured in shadows, heat, and soft flower dust, and you feel yourself drawn deeper into the slow, meticulous, and oddly comforting world of Egyptian bakers and their precise yet human dance with time. You step into the flurry of market preparations, where trays of freshly baked loaves are being readied for transport. The courtyard hums with energy, yet there is a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm in the way bakers arrange their wares. You probably won't survive the physical juggling of dozens of reed trays, but observing it is like watching a careful choreography. Each loaf is placed precisely, some marked with subtle indentations or symbols, tiny signatures of the baker, or indicators of type, flavor, or intended recipient. Historians still debate whether these markings were standardized across the city or idiosyncratic flourishes unique to each workshop. The reed boats waiting along the Nile's edge are surprisingly elegant, small, flat-bottomed vessels capable of carrying dozens of loaves at once. You watch as bakers and apprentices lift the trays with practiced hands, balancing them expertly against the sway of the boat. Some bakers decorate the bread with simple impressions, a circle here, a cross there, or faint flower patterns that might seem purely decorative but carry functional meaning. Fringe theories suggest these patterns could serve as codes for trade, identifying origin, quality, or even subtle flavoring. You probably won't survive deciphering every nuance, yet imagining a hidden bakery code brings a mischievous grin to your face. Along the quayside, merchants inspect the trays, occasionally lifting a loaf and smelling its crumb. You notice the small rituals, a gentle tap, a careful turn, or a light squeeze to test texture. Some bakers occasionally added miniature offerings, tiny figurines or crumbs placed atop the loaves, as part of ritualistic practice. Historians still argue whether this was a common spiritual observance or a fringe custom among a few devout bakers. You lean in, inhaling the soft scent of baking bread mixed with river air, and realize how subtle and intricate the practice truly is, blending commerce, craftsmanship, and ritual. You follow a tray as it's loaded onto a reed boat, feeling the gentle sway beneath your feet. The loaves are stacked carefully with small reed separators to prevent crushing. You can hear the faint slap of water against the hull, punctuated by the occasional laugh or instruction shouted in the soft marketplace hum. A fringe theory holds that bakers occasionally baked loaves in symbolic shapes, miniature boats, birds, or animals, hoping for safe travel and good fortune for the merchant. You probably won't survive taking these superstitions at face value for long, yet the thought adds a gentle, whimsical layer to the work. Nearby, a master baker oversees the arrangements, nodding at apprentices who adjust trays and correct minor tilts. You notice how attention to detail extends to the flour dusting on the boat's surfaces and the careful positioning of each loaf's markings. Scholars still argue whether ancient bakers enforced strict quality standards or whether variability was tolerated as part of the charm and labor constraints of city life. You lean back, imagining the boats drifting down the Nile, loaves swaying gently in rhythm with the current, the soft clatter of the marketplace fading behind you. Decorative impressions on loaves sometimes indicated who had baked them, or even their intended recipient. You catch a glimpse of a small fish symbol pressed into a tray, likely a signal for a specific client or market stall. Fringe interpretations suggest these tiny carvings might also reflect seasonal festivals, harvest celebrations, or subtle messages between baker and buyer. You probably won't survive decoding every mark, yet observing the patterns reminds you that even in the routine, commerce and culture intertwine in quiet, fascinating ways. As the boats are pushed gently into the river, sunlight glints off the water, casting shimmering reflections onto the walls of nearby workshops. You watch loaves balance on reed supports, feeling the gentle sway beneath your feet, and realize that the day's work has seamlessly blended labor, artistry, and ritual. Historians still debate whether bakers planned their schedules around exact river currents, or if timing was learned intuitively through experience. Regardless, you feel a soft satisfaction, the rhythmic motion and smells of the market weaving into a gentle, soothing cadence that carries you forward into the next phase of observation. You imagine the solemnity of presenting bread to the pharaoh or city officials, an exercise in etiquette, precision, and subtle ceremony. The loaves are arranged carefully on trays, each positioned to showcase its texture, shape, and subtle decorations. You probably won't survive the pressure of balancing artistry, flavor, and timing in front of someone so important. Yet here, the baker moves with calm expertise, as if performing a familiar dance. Historians still argue whether the pharaoh's daily bread offerings were ritualized with strict protocol or guided more loosely by custom and convenience. You step closer, noting some curious flavors. A hint of beer in one loaf, a drizzle of honey in another, or even crushed herbs tucked inside. These unusual choices might have been designed to suit particular tastes, perhaps the preferences of high-ranking officials, or they could reflect playful experimentation by bakers confident enough to test boundaries. Fringe theories suggest some loaves were intentionally sweetened or spiced to honor the gods, blending culinary practice with subtle spiritual observances. You probably won't survive discerning the nuanced flavors after only a whiff, but imagining these experiments adds a light-hearted texture to your understanding of their work. Apprentices fidget nervously, adjusting trays and checking alignment against the shadow clock, which still guides the pacing of the day. Every loaf must be ready at just the right moment. Too early and it cools before presentation. Too late, and the pharaoh's breakfast may be delayed. Some historians propose that bakers were required to memorize a strict schedule, yet others suggest that timing was intuitive, guided by experience and subtle environmental cues. You watch the master baker gently instruct a hesitant apprentice, demonstrating that precision is achieved through observation, patience, and a soft touch. You notice that some loaves carry tiny decorative impressions, lotus flowers, fish, or abstract geometric patterns. These were not merely ornamental. They may have indicated intended recipients, symbolic meaning, or even seasonal significance. Fringe interpretations suggest that certain patterns were believed to enhance flavor or preserve freshness. Though this remains speculative, you probably won't survive fully cataloging the symbolic lexicon of every mark, but the care with which each impression is applied reveals a world where aesthetics, function, and subtle superstition coexist. The presentation ritual itself is surprisingly tactile. Hands hover over the loaves, adjusting alignment, tapping gently to test firmness, or brushing away stray flour. You notice apprentices taking small, cautious breaths, aware that each movement contributes to the final impression. Some bakers whispered to their bread during this process, a quiet encouragement akin to a parent soothing a child, a fringe habit that historians debate as either symbolic ritual or comforting routine. You probably won't survive adopting all these micro-practices yourself, yet you can imagine the soothing rhythm of gentle taps and flour-dusted hands as a kind of silent meditation. A gentle breeze drifts across the courtyard, carrying the combined aromas of baked bread, honey, and the faint tang of beer-infused dough. You pause, letting the scent settle in your senses, and you notice the subtle smiles exchanged among the bakers as a perfectly arranged tray is finally ready. Some scholars argue whether these offerings influenced the pharaoh's favor or were purely ceremonial gestures. Yet it is clear that care and subtle artistry were valued alongside taste. You probably won't survive the internal scrutiny of a pharaoh's inspector, but observing the process is oddly soothing, a slow-motion ballet of sensory precision. By the time the trays are lifted and carried forward, you feel a quiet satisfaction in having witnessed the delicate balance of ritual, flavor, and timing. Each loaf embodies skill, intuition, and the gentle interplay of ingredients and human hands. You probably won't survive a full day at this level of detail. Yet the ceremonial presentation leaves a lingering impression, even in the most exacting contexts. Egyptian bakers infused their craft with care, subtle humor, and a touch of creative whimsy, preparing you for the slower, reflective afternoon that awaits. The afternoon brings a slower rhythm, and you wander into the quieter side alleys of the bakery quarter, where the sun has softened and loaves cool on reed trays. The scent of baked bread mingles with the faint tang of river water and dust from clay walls, creating a sensory tapestry that is both grounding and hypnotic. You probably won't survive a whole day immersed in these quiet corners without becoming slightly drowsy, yet this lull allows you to notice small, often overlooked details. Stray grains of wheat rolling across the stone floor, a soft rustle of aprons as apprentices move from oven to storage, and tiny clouds of flour puffing lazily into shafts of sunlight. Historians still wonder whether these afternoon pauses were merely practical for cooling loaves or part of a deliberate rhythm designed to maintain worker focus and dough quality. You pause beside a cooling tray, watching steam rise gently from the warm bread. Some bakers sprinkle tiny seeds on top, perhaps for flavor, texture, or visual appeal. Fringe theories suggest that certain seed patterns were believed to bring good fortune or protect the loaves from spoilage. You probably won't survive understanding the full symbolic lexicon baked into each batch, but observing these subtle choices hints at a world where daily work intertwined with ritual and superstition. The apprentices move carefully, brushing crumbs from trays and testing the bread's firmness with gentle taps, a quiet dance that is mesmerizing in its precision. Small superstitions seem to dot the afternoon like invisible threads. You notice a master baker placing a tiny pebble under a tray, claiming it ensures even rising, or drawing a faint line in flour as a guide. Scholars still debate whether these gestures were widespread beliefs or personal eccentricities, yet they add a playful, human element to an otherwise disciplined routine. You probably won't survive adopting all these little rituals yourself, yet watching them unfold provides a gentle humor, like a wink from history's past. A soft breeze drifts through the alley, carrying scents of cooling bread and distant river water. You crouch near a loaf, observing how the texture shifts as it loses heat, tiny bubbles deflating slowly, giving the surface a delicate, crinkled pattern. Apprentices whisper to each other, noting which loaves might be best for sale, which for ceremonial use, and which might need gentle reshaping. Fringe theories hold that bakers occasionally used subtle chants or hand gestures during this cooling period, believing it influenced the bread's final texture. Historians remain skeptical, but you can't help imagining the quiet attentiveness and gentle care woven into these ordinary moments. You stroll further down a sunlit alley, catching the sight of a baker's tiny shrine tucked against the wall. A small figurine rests beside a cooling tray, alongside a few grains of wheat and a sprig of herb. Some bakers included these elements as a nod to protective deities, or as personal tokens of good fortune. You probably won't survive keeping track of all these small gestures, yet each one contributes to the sense that baking was more than routine. It was a life infused with attention, care, and subtle symbolism. Observing the quiet corners also allows you to notice the softer interactions between bakers and apprentices. There's a gentle teasing as someone misplaces a tray, a soft sigh when a loaf cools unevenly, and the careful mentoring that corrects mistakes without harsh words. Scholars still argue whether these social dynamics were standardized across workshops or unique to particular masters, but the consistent thread of mentorship is unmistakable. You probably won't survive replicating this delicate social dance, yet you can appreciate how subtly it structured the flow of daily work. As the afternoon wanes, the courtyard and alleys seem bathed in a gentle golden glow. Cooling loaves, soft chatter, and faint shadows combine to form a quiet lullaby of ordinary life. You notice how small superstitions, careful observation, and sensory attentiveness converge to create an almost meditative environment. The rhythm of work and rest is both deliberate and calming, offering a gentle pause before the next stage of the day, where ingredients are measured with meticulous precision and ovens are tended with experienced hands. You probably won't survive the full depth of attention required to maintain this balance, yet observing it gently nudges your own mind toward reflection, patience, and a soft, drifting awareness. Late afternoon brings a new energy to the courtyard, quieter than the morning bustle, but with a more reflective, deliberate pace. You watch bakers preparing small batches for the evening, measuring flour with worn wooden rods and gently sprinkling water from shallow basins. The rhythmic motions feel almost ritualistic. Pinch, fold, press, tap. A meditative cycle that draws your attention and slows your thoughts. You probably won't survive keeping the same level of focus for hours on end, yet the hypnotic repetition encourages a calm, sleepy awareness. Historians still debate whether bakers considered these routines practical necessities, spiritual exercises, or a subtle combination of both. You notice a peculiar mixture in a small clay jar, a blend of ground herbs and grains, lightly moistened. Fringe theories suggest these additives were intended to improve fermentation, flavor, or even luck, depending on the baker's beliefs. You carefully sniff the mixture, detecting faintly sweet and earthy notes that mingle harmoniously with the aroma of cooling bread. Scholars argue whether such additives were widespread or reserved for special ceremonial loaves, yet the presence of these experiments highlights the creativity underlying even routine baking. You probably won't survive cataloging every secret blend, But observing the subtle ingenuity of bakers offers a satisfying, gentle fascination. Trays are gently shifted from one table to another, occasionally brushed free of stray flour or debris. The apprentice's movements are precise yet relaxed, informed by hours of observation and practice. You notice a fringe habit. Some bakers lightly tap trays 3 times before leaving them, a silent superstition claiming it improves the rise or wards off imbalance in the dough. Historians remain skeptical, but the tactile rhythm of these tiny rituals contributes to the overall sensory experience, a slow, almost imperceptible music of motion, sound, and smell. You probably won't survive memorizing every small superstition, but appreciating its charm is effortless. Meanwhile, the shadow clock continues its quiet sweep across the courtyard, marking the gradual passage of afternoon. You follow the shadow with your eyes, noting how it crosses ovens, trays, and tables in a steady, silent rhythm. Some scholars argue that bakers adjusted their actions to the shadow line, using it to gauge dough readiness or oven temperature. Others suggest the tool was more symbolic, a gentle reminder of the day's flow rather than a precise instrument. You probably won't survive perfect alignment of every loaf to the shadow, yet watching it glide slowly over the courtyard encourages a sense of order and calm. You notice the apprentices tasting small pieces of dough or checking the texture with fingers, performing delicate assessments. Some scholars argue that the inclusion of honey, beer, or other additives required nuanced handling, as they could subtly affect rise and flavor. Fringe theories suggest bakers whispered tiny encouragements to dough, a personal ritual that may have been comforting rather than scientifically impactful. You probably won't survive conducting these assessments with perfect skill, yet witnessing them adds a gentle humor to the scene, a reminder that careful work need not be solemn. In one corner, a small pile of flour dust catches the sunlight, swirling in faint eddies as a gentle breeze passes. You kneel and trace the patterns it forms, watching how tiny particles dance before settling into delicate curves. Some bakers claimed that observing these dust movements predicted dough behavior, a fringe technique blending observation, superstition, and playful intuition. Historians remain skeptical, yet there's no denying the meditative quality of watching such subtle phenomena unfold. You probably won't survive adopting all these micro-observations, yet simply witnessing them fosters a calming awareness of time and patience. As the sun lowers, the courtyard feels softer, cooler, and more subdued. Trays of dough are left to rest, ovens gradually reduce their heat, and shadows lengthen in the golden light. You probably won't survive a full day in this environment without feeling both fatigue and fascination, yet the subtle rhythms, gentle scents, and small human quirks form a perfect lullaby of ordinary life. Observing bakers blend careful measurement, playful superstition, and slow, deliberate labor, you sense a harmony between human effort and the natural world, a gentle echo that invites reflection, patience, and a soft, drifting calm. As evening approaches, the courtyard takes on a more contemplative atmosphere. The shadows stretch long and thin, curling across the stone floor and over trays of cooling bread, while the scent of flour, yeast, and faint smoke lingers in the air. You probably won't survive the constant sensory layering for hours without becoming drowsy, yet the gentle cadence of the baker's movements is oddly soothing. Each motion, dusting, lifting, rotating, tapping, is deliberate, measured, and quiet, forming a subtle rhythm that hums alongside the fading light. Historians still debate whether this evening pace was an intentional part of the workflow, or simply a natural slowing dictated by heat, fatigue, and ambient conditions. You approach a long bench where smaller, experimental loaves are set aside. Some contain unusual grains, others subtle herb mixtures, or slight additions of honey or beer. Fringe theories suggest that these loaves were trials for festival days, special ceremonies, or even divine favor, though the evidence remains speculative. You probably won't survive identifying all variations, yet observing the delicate differences sparks a quiet curiosity, as if you were witnessing the tiniest whispers of creative expression in an otherwise structured craft. Apprentices move softly among the trays, adjusting angles to catch residual warmth from the ovens, and ensuring none of the loaves are disturbed. Some use small sticks to measure exact spacing between trays, a precision that seems excessive at first, but becomes mesmerizing as you follow the methodical motions. Scholars still argue whether such extreme attention to spacing affected the bread's quality significantly, or if it was primarily an aesthetic and procedural preference. You probably won't survive replicating this level of meticulousness. Yet watching it unfold feels like a gentle lesson in patience and subtle artistry. Nearby, a clay jar bubbles faintly with active yeast starter. You crouch to observe the microcosm of life within, tiny gas bubbles forming and collapsing with quiet rhythm. Some bakers whispered encouragement or gently stirred the starter as part of personal ritual. Fringe ideas suggest that the sound of gentle humming or careful tapping influenced fermentation, though historians remain skeptical. You probably won't survive taking this belief literally, yet it adds a whimsical charm to the otherwise methodical scene. You notice faint impressions on the loaves that hint at the baker's personality. A swirl here, a pinch there, a slight asymmetry that might go unnoticed by most. Scholars still argue whether these subtle marks were intentional signatures or incidental consequences of hands and tools in motion. You probably won't survive cataloguing every subtle variation. Yet the presence of these personal touches humanizes the craft, reminding you that history was lived by individuals, not just processes. A gentle breeze flows through the courtyard, lifting faint particles of flour and stirring the scent of yeast. You pause to watch the interplay of light, shadow, and movement, feeling a deep, almost meditative connection to the slow unfolding of the day. Fringe theories propose that bakers could read the air, temperature, and dust patterns to anticipate changes in dough behavior. Historians remain cautious, but you probably won't survive ignoring the subtlety of these observational skills, and appreciating them becomes part of the gentle, hypnotic experience. As the sun dips lower, you feel the courtyard soften, the residual warmth of ovens, the quiet rustle of aprons, the slow, deliberate movements of bakers and apprentices, all combine to create a lullaby-like atmosphere. You probably won't survive participating in every nuanced ritual, yet watching and inhaling these sensory cues instills a gentle, reflective calm. The interplay of heat, shadow, scent, and tactile precision forms a delicate choreography that carries you effortlessly toward the day's slower, reflective end, inviting both awe and gentle drowsiness. Twilight settles softly over the courtyard, and you notice how the colors shift. Clay walls glowing rose gold, trays of bread bathed in muted amber light, and shadows stretching long and thin across the stone floor. You probably won't survive spending hours observing these subtle shifts without your eyelids growing heavy. Yet there's a hypnotic beauty in how each loaf, tray, and shadow interacts with the dimming sun. Historians still debate whether bakers relied on twilight cues to finalize their day, or if the visual changes were incidental, a quiet accompaniment to evening routines. You wander closer to the ovens, now cooling slowly, their surfaces radiating gentle warmth into the courtyard. You feel the subtle heat against your hands and wrists, and notice the faint smell of baked grains mingling with the earthy scent of clay. Some bakers leave small scraps of dough near the oven's edge to test future fermentation, a quirky experiment that may have doubled as a snack or ritual offering. Fringe theories suggest that this practice held symbolic meaning, connecting the daily act of baking to divine oversight. You probably won't survive testing these experimental pieces yourself, yet observing them adds a playful, human dimension to the day's precision. Apprentices move quietly through the courtyard, carrying small trays towards storage rooms or gently placing loaves on cooling racks. You notice the soft scraping of reeds against stone, the occasional tap of a fingertip testing loaf texture, and the whisper of conversation, low and careful. Scholars still argue whether evening tasks were meant purely for practical storage or also served as reflection periods, allowing bakers to review the day's work and refine techniques. You probably won't survive every micro step of their process, yet watching it unfold instills a gentle sense of rhythm and meditation. Some loaves bear faint impressions, tiny crosses, circles, or subtle marks identifying either the baker, intended recipient, or type of bread. Fringe interpretations suggest that these symbols could encode ceremonial or festive meanings, though evidence is largely circumstantial. You bend closer to examine a series of small, flower-like impressions, and feel a quiet appreciation for the blend of artistry and practicality. You probably won't survive decoding every symbolic mark, yet simply noticing them offers insight into the human impulse to personalize even routine tasks. You pause near a small basin where water slowly drips from a clay jug, the tiny sound punctuating the gentle hush of evening. Some bakers reportedly use these moments to quietly hum or chant, a practice believed to encourage favorable dough rise or simply calm the apprentices. Historians remain divided on whether these rituals had any practical effect, yet they contribute to the atmosphere of gentle attentiveness. You probably won't survive the hum of ritual and work simultaneously, yet feeling its presence softens the courtyard into something almost meditative. A faint breeze carries the scent of herbs, dust, and cooling grain, and you watch flour dust swirl lazily in shafts of fading sunlight. Fringe theories suggest bakers read these tiny air movements as subtle indicators of humidity or temperature, anticipating changes that might affect the dough. You probably won't survive trying to master such a skill yourself, yet observing it now feels like witnessing a quiet, ancient form of mindfulness. Every gesture, tap, and gentle adjustment becomes part of a soft choreography that guides both loaves and bakers alike through the closing hours. As the sky darkens to a deepening blue and shadows grow long and indistinct, the courtyard gradually slows. Ovens are tended one last time, trays are stacked or stored, and apprentices begin winding down their careful movements. You probably won't survive participating fully in the twilight routine, yet observing it provides a gentle, immersive lull. The warmth of ovens, the subtle tactile rhythm of trays and dough, and the fading light together forming a slow, hypnotic cadence that primes your mind for reflection, rest, and gentle sleepiness. Night falls softly over the bakery quarter, and the courtyard takes on a hushed, almost reverent atmosphere. The last embers in the ovens glow faintly, radiating a gentle heat that mingles with the cooler night air. You probably won't survive a full night of quiet observation without drifting into drowsiness. Yet there is a comforting rhythm here. The soft scraping of reed trays being stacked, the muted murmur of apprentices tidying up, and the occasional clink of clay jars being set in place. Historians still argue whether the final evening routines were primarily practical or also imbued with ritual significance, yet the effect on the senses is undeniable. You move toward a small table where leftover dough portions are being measured and portioned for the next day. Some bakers sprinkle tiny herbs or seeds, perhaps as flavor experiments or as minor ritualistic gestures. Fringe theories suggest these micro-additions were intended to guide fermentation or convey symbolic meanings, though direct evidence is limited. You probably won't survive conducting these small but meticulous actions yourself, yet observing them now reinforces the sense of care, intention, and human touch that permeates every stage of baking. Apprentices whisper quietly among themselves, comparing notes on loaves that turned out especially well or struggled to rise. You notice their fingers brushing faint flour dust from trays, a delicate gesture that maintains both hygiene and aesthetics. Scholars still debate whether this quiet discussion served merely as peer review or subtly encoded apprenticeship lessons that transmitted knowledge without formal writing. You probably won't survive the depth of attentiveness required to catch every nuance, yet the scene offers a gentle reflection on the layered complexity of craft, tradition, and human observation. In one corner, a small jar of active yeast bubbles gently, the soft hiss and rise almost inaudible in the night. Some bakers reportedly placed a tiny token or charm nearby, claiming it encouraged a stronger rise or simply brought good fortune. Fringe interpretations vary. Perhaps these gestures were symbolic, perhaps comforting, perhaps simply habit. You probably won't survive fully testing these beliefs, yet watching them unfold reminds you that the mundane often carried subtle layers of meaning and ritual. You wander past stacks of cooling bread, noting the tiny differences in crust, shape, and surface texture. Some loaves carry impressions of lotus flowers or geometric patterns, marks that may indicate type, origin, or intended use. Historians still argue whether these symbols were primarily functional or ornamental, yet they add a playful, human touch to what might otherwise seem like purely utilitarian objects. You probably won't survive cataloguing every mark, yet appreciating them in passing is a gentle meditation on the personal imprint of the bakers. The courtyard is now wrapped in shadows, with only faint lamplight illuminating corners, where apprentices continue minor tasks, sweeping floors, checking trays, or preparing small containers of yeast for the next day. Some bakers softly chant a closing prayer, believed to protect both the workshop and the day's labor. Fringe theories suggest that the combination of light, shadow, and subtle ritual created an environment conducive to calm and attentive work, though historians debate the extent of any intended mystical effect. You probably won't survive participating fully, yet you feel the soothing cadence of the evening routine wash over you. Finally, the courtyard grows still. Ovens have cooled, trays are stacked, and apprentices depart, leaving behind the faint aroma of bread, flour, and distant river water. You probably won't survive following every subtle gesture, ritual, and observation, yet watching the space empty with care and quiet forms a slow, gentle lull. The day's work concludes not with drama, but with a soft, reflective rhythm. A slow, decrescendo of motion, sound, and scent that invites the mind to release tension, settle, and drift. You can sense the continuity between yesterday, today, and tomorrow, a timeless ballet of human effort, natural rhythms, and subtle artistry. Late night envelops the bakery quarter, and you linger among the empty tables, cooling trays, and dormant ovens. The courtyard feels almost sacred in its silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant murmur from the Nile. You probably won't survive a full nocturnal vigil here without succumbing to drowsiness. Yet there is a hypnotic comfort in the emptiness, the residual warmth of the day, the lingering aroma of baked grains, and the faint glimmer of moonlight across clay walls. Historians still debate whether these quiet periods were seen as mere downtime or an opportunity for reflection and subtle observation. You notice small jars of leftover starter carefully sealed and tucked away, each labelled with delicate inscriptions or symbolic marks. Some bakers claim these markers indicate optimal fermentation or even forecast flavour nuances for the next day. Fringe theories suggest that the bakers spoke softly to the jars, believing attention could influence rising behaviour, though evidence is speculative. You probably won't survive fully testing these whispered rituals, yet the notion adds a gentle, human touch to otherwise methodical practice. In the corner, a shadow falls over an intricate reed tray, where tiny imperfections in loaves from earlier are visible. Slightly cracked crust, subtle asymmetry, or faint flower patterns. You examine these quietly, appreciating the uniqueness of each creation. Scholars still argue whether imperfections were tolerated for functional reasons, or whether they carried subtle social or ritualistic meaning. You probably won't survive cataloguing every minor difference, yet simply noticing them fosters a gentle mindfulness, encouraging observation without urgency. You wander toward the shadow clock one last time. The gnomon casts a thin line across the courtyard, now nearly motionless in the still night. Some bakers reportedly use the shadow's final position to mark day's end, a gentle signal to close ovens and store ingredients. Fringe interpretations suggest that the clock also served as a symbolic reminder of natural order, a soft anchor linking human effort to celestial cycles. You probably won't survive observing these subtle measures for weeks on end, yet the quiet symbolism reinforces a sense of calm and order. The courtyard's aroma is softer now, no longer dominated by heat or rising yeast, but lingering sweet and earthy undertones that gently mix with the night air. Apprentices sweep lightly, stacking trays and adjusting small jars. Scholars debate whether evening tidiness was primarily for hygiene or for ritualized completion of the day's work. You probably won't survive performing each motion with the same precision, yet observing these quiet gestures encourages a soft, meditative awareness. A faint breeze stirs flour dust and carries the smell of distant river water, mingling with the residual warmth of clay ovens. You crouch to watch the interplay of light, shadow, and dust, noticing how tiny movements create subtle, shifting patterns. Fringe theories suggest that bakers might have interpreted these subtle cues to anticipate temperature and humidity, though historians remain skeptical. You probably won't survive mastering such subtle observational skills, yet simply noticing them draws you deeper into the hypnotic rhythm of ancient routine. Finally, the courtyard grows utterly still. Trays, ovens, and jars all rest, the day's labor complete. You probably won't survive participating fully in every nuance of this day, yet observing its conclusion offers a profound sense of calm. Motion slows to a whisper, scents soften, shadows fade, and the gentle legacy of skill, care, and human touch lingers in the night air. The quiet breath of history settles around you, inviting reflection, gentle awareness, and a soft readiness for rest. The night deepens, and you linger in the courtyard one final time, absorbing the stillness that blankets the bakery quarter. Moonlight glints off cooled clay ovens and stacked reed trays, casting long, gentle shadows that seem to stretch forever. You probably won't survive staying awake through the entirety of this nocturnal calm. Yet there is something quietly mesmerizing about the way light, shadow, and scent linger in perfect balance. Historians still argue whether the quiet of night was simply a pause or an essential part of Baker's subtle observational practices. You walk slowly past trays of bread, now fully cooled, inhaling the soft, lingering aroma that combines wheat, honey, and faint traces of smoke. Some bakers left tiny offerings of crumbs or miniature loaves, a whimsical nod to gods, luck, or personal superstition. Fringe interpretations suggest these acts carried symbolic meaning for future success or protection, though evidence remains speculative. You probably won't survive testing the efficacy of these tiny rituals yourself, yet observing them offers a gentle connection to the quiet creativity embedded in daily life. Apprentices have mostly gone, leaving only a few lingering shadows moving carefully among jars of starter, small bowls of herbs, and stacks of trays. Their whispered conversations about dough, temperature, and subtle techniques are almost inaudible. Scholars debate whether these nocturnal observations were systematic training exercises, or simply soft mentoring. Yet they form part of the hypnotic, meditative rhythm that governs the workspace. You probably won't survive mastering every subtle practice, but noticing them draws you deeper into the serene cadence of this historical routine. You pause by the shadow clock one last time. The gnomon is still, its line faintly etched across the courtyard in soft silver light. Some bakers reportedly use this quiet moment to reflect, plan the next day's work, or silently note observations of dough behavior, oven heat, and subtle atmospheric changes. Fringe theories suggest this was a form of nightly meditation, blending observation, intuition, and ritual into a single, gentle practice. You probably won't survive adopting this level of attentiveness, yet simply witnessing it evokes a calm, reflective appreciation of time measured not just by hours but by care, patience, and observation. The night air carries the faint scent of river water, mingling with residual warmth from ovens and the soft sweetness of bread. You notice minute details, the gentle creases of crust, subtle variations in tray alignment, and faint impressions left by the baker's fingers. Scholars still debate whether these finishing touches had practical function, symbolic meaning, or were simply habitual gestures, yet together they complete the day's choreography. You probably won't survive cataloguing every mark, but the accumulation of small attentive acts forms a soothing, almost lullaby-like cadence. As the courtyard finally settles into complete stillness, you feel a soft, enveloping calm. Shadows stretch long, scents fade gently, and the warmth of the day lingers in tactile memory. Fringe interpretations suggest that bakers' nightly routines were as much about cultivating awareness, patience, and calm as about preparing bread, a reflection of the slow, attentive rhythm that governed ancient life. You probably won't survive practicing every step, yet simply observing the cycle allows your mind to drift into gentle reflection and ease. Slowly, your focus softens. The ovens rest, trays cool, jars are tucked away, and the courtyard seems suspended between day and night. You probably won't survive following every subtle gesture and observation, yet the lingering harmony of heat, shadow, scent, and human care forms a gentle lullaby. You inhale the faint aroma of bread one last time, the warmth of the day's labor radiating quietly, and allow your mind to float with the calm cadence of history. The courtyard, the bakers, the ovens, and even the silent shadow clock fades softly into memory, leaving you in a gentle, reflective, and sleepy stillness.